So this is the third annual Spirit in the City conference. It's dedicated to faith and evangelisation and keeping faith alive, or bringing faith alive in culture and public affairs. We will move on and introduce David Van Gend. Dr. David Van Gend is one of the nation's most prominent pro-life and culture of life leaders. He's been active in ethical stem cell research and pro-life campaigns. He's a medical doctor, a senior lecturer in medicine here at UQ. And would you please welcome David Van Gend to the floor.
So thanks very much. Thanks, David. Thank you, Alistair. It is not said we shall prevail, save as his cross prevails. The good we mean and will to do prospers if he wants it to, and if not, then it fails. Nor is failure our disgrace. In ways we cannot know, he holds the merit in his hand, and suddenly, as no one planned, behold, the kingdom grow. So we're lucky because even if we lose, we still win. Even if it looks desperate, we've still got hope. And I'm not exaggerating to say that to be a Christian, if we lose this vote, will become like living among wolves. Wolves who want to attack the innocence of our children and grandchildren with their hideous, disturbing and indecent material that will be imposed on them at schools. And wolves that want to terrify our pastors and bishops into silence not through knives, not through hammers, but through that constricting, crushing force of human rights tribunals, anti-discrimination law, intimidation at a social level. Our whole message to that 50% of the population who really don't care but might listen to one message, that message is that same-sex marriage will have consequences that will affect your family. It will affect what your children are taught in school. It'll be safe schools on steroids. Once same-sex marriage is the law of the land, once it is enshrined in the central institution of society, it's going to be very hard for parents to push back against the normalisation of radical gender theory and LGBT sex education in our schools, as we've seen overseas. And likewise, right now, those of us who are taken to the human rights tribunals can win. So I've been taken to the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Tribunal for saying that a child, where possible, should have a mum and a dad, and it's wrong for two men to deprive a child of a mother. Off I go to the Human Rights Tribunal. Now, of course I win. Of course I dismiss that vexatious complaint. But maybe I won't once I'm speaking against the law of the land. Right now, the law of the land is on my side. It was on Archbishop Porteous' side. It's on Bernie Gaynor's side. And so eventually we win. I don't expect that sort of mercy from the thought police once they have the law on their side. That changing the meaning of marriage changes so much else. It changes what our children are taught in school, as we've seen overseas. Gay marriage means gay sex education, and parents will have no say. Just look at the evidence. In Canada, Steve Touloukis tried to withdraw his children from classes that promoted homosexual activity. He went to court, but was told there that tolerance was no longer enough in this era of same-sex marriage. All children, including his Christian children, were now required to celebrate homosexual, bisexual, transsexual matters. In the USA, Rob and Robin Worthlin were told by the courts in Massachusetts that they had no right to take their child out of classes that promoted homosexual issues, since gay marriage was now the law of the land. You see the logic. In the UK, Vishnitz Jewish Girls Primary School right now faces closure if it does not agree to teach primary school girls about gender reassignment, homosexuality and transgender issues. Now, this school had no problems with the authorities prior to the change in the law to allow same-sex marriage. In Canada, another example, the Alberta Education Department has imposed gender fluidity policies on all schools since same-sex marriage became law, specifying boys must be free to wear the uniform of their choice, they must be free to play in girls' sports teams if they want to, and use the bathrooms of their choice. Now, of course, that makes sense if male and female doesn't matter in marriage, because if it doesn't, then why should male and female matter anywhere in society? If we enshrine genderless marriage in our law, we cannot keep genderless sex education out of our classrooms. Just last week, a teenage girl in Canberra who simply posted "It's okay to say no" on her Facebook page was sacked for hate speech. Madeline, you may have seen her story. A gay student at Queensland University who spoke out against gay marriage, was shouted down and abused as a homophobe. Now, if people who believe in natural marriage are harassed like this while they are simply agreeing with the law, how will they be treated once their beliefs are opposed by the law? So, one thing I have learnt from long involvement in this debate is that for serious LGBT activists, marriage equality is not about marriage, it is about power. It is about obtaining the legal power that comes when you enshrine same-sex marriage in law and using that power to implement the rest of that intolerant, radical LGBT agenda. They know that a law for same-sex marriage will give them this power because it will be aided by the elites in the human rights commissions. And it's not about equality either, because there's actually no discrimination in Australian law against same-sex couples or gay and lesbian individuals. Since 2008, gay couples have had full relationship equality with man-woman couples. De facto gay couples, de facto straight couples, absolutely no difference. And the difference in marriage is merely a matter of convenience, not discrimination, in certain procedural matters, which can be dealt with in other ways. So by voting yes, we don't change a gay couple's legal status, but we do give activists new power over our families and our freedoms. So in order to talk about a couple of the other things that we hold dear, I have to take the campaign jacket off because this is off message. I could sit Australians down and talk about anything other than the consequences. It would be to talk about the principles, that same-sex marriage is simply untrue and unjust. It is untrue to nature and timeless culture, and it is unjust to future children who will be deliberately deprived by law of either their mother or their father within this new institution. But you talk to people these days on those principled matters and their eyes tend to glaze over, not in an audience like this. When the plebiscite was announced, my group, the Australian Marriage Forum, sent out a media release essentially saying it is a sign of advanced social dementia that we would even be thinking of changing the meaning of marriage. No plebiscite, no government, no court has the authority to do that. Marriage is not a social invention that we can cut to shape according to political fashion. It is a social recognition of a pre-existing reality, male, female, and offspring. The great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss knew this when he said, "Marriage is a social institution with a biological foundation," end quote. So all of our social laws and cultural efforts around marriage exist to reinforce that foundation, to help keep a man with his mate, for the sake of social stability, but above all for the sake of any children they might create. Now, of course, not all marriages do create children, but typically they do. And an institution exists for the typical case. And marriages that don't create children are still fully marriages because they fulfill the two criteria. of marriage. They bring together the two halves of nature, male and female, in that unique conjugal union. And they can give a child the mother and father relationship a child needs, albeit an adopted child. Now, same-sex couples cannot bring together the two halves of nature in a conjugal union, and they cannot give a child the mother and father relationship a child needs. It is not a slight or an insult to say that two men cannot marry. It is a statement of the biological obvious. Now, same-sex relationships matter greatly to those people involved, and they demand neighbourly civility, but those relationships are a different kind of thing to that great natural project, that vocation of marriage and family, and any sane society would use a different word. We had Keith Mills, the gay guy from Ireland, over a couple of weeks ago. He and Paddy Manning did that wonderful video for the Irish referendum as gay men against gay marriage. And Paddy put it better than anyone when he said, as a gay man, same-sex relationships are different to a marriage because marriage is fundamentally about children and giving children their mother and their father. Recognising difference is not discrimination. End quote. So the proposition of same-sex marriage is simply untrue. Even some atheists acknowledge that. Bertrand Russell, in his book Marriage and Morals back in 1929, he said, the atheist philosopher, it is through children alone that sexual relations become of importance to society and worthy to be taken cognizance of by a legal institution. End quote. Same-sex couples cannot create children. There is no social reason to recognise that institution in law. Even the ancient world understood this. Father Douglas is from Babylon. And 4,000 years ago, Hammurabi's code, King Gadusha of Babylon, created conditions for marriage that we would recognise today, even down to the needing consent from the in-laws. It is a feature of every culture at every age because it is a natural phenomenon that cultures simply recognise and reinforce. That is marriage. And the Romans had the most beautiful word for it. The ancient Romans gave us the word matrimony. That is made of two words, mater, meaning mother, monium, meaning state or condition. So matrimony is the institution built around the condition of motherhood. And mothers are built around babies for 9 long months. And babies are built around the double helix of DNA. One strand from the mother, one strand from the father, entwined and encoded into that unique new name that has never been spoken, formed into that face which resembles that man and that woman who gave that baby existence. That is matrimony. That is marriage and family. That is, as Bob Santamaria used to say, nature's masterpiece. And to any sane society, it can only be a man-woman thing. Looks at the elements of injustice to future children by abolishing the only institution that is built around the child, specifically around their kinship needs, legitimating them with their mother and their father, their kinship. And it is being usurped by adults who consider that their emotional validation is so important that they can destroy the structure that forever and ever has been built around the needs of the child. Such is the injustice. And when you listen to children who've been brought up in a structure like this, you remember Katie Faust was out here a couple of weeks ago. She loves her two lesbian mothers. But she says things like, quote, redefining marriage redefines parenthood. It moves us well beyond our live and let live philosophy into the land where our society promotes a family structure where children will always suffer loss. Always. Have we really arrived at a time, says Katie, when we are considering institutionalising the stripping of a child's natural right to a mother and father in order to validate the emotions of adults? Heather Barwick, also in 2015 in America, confessed, my father's absence created a huge hole in me, and I ached every day for a dad. I loved my mum's partner, but another mum could never have replaced the father I lost. Same-sex marriage and parenting, says Heather Barwick, withholds either a mother or father from a child while telling him or her that it doesn't matter, that it's all the same. But it's not, says Heather. A lot of us, a lot of your kids are hurting. You can hear it from them in their testimony, or you can go to the social science and you can see that we are wantonly creating a family structure which we know as surely as we can know anything in social science will be detrimental to those children. There is no fact more established in social science, as I quote David Popenow from Rutgers University, that children raised by their natural biological parents, their married biological parents, do better in almost every regard on average. On average. The preponderance of evidence shows quite significant detriment, even emotional harm to children, on average, who are raised in same-sex parented households. But who cares? Who cares about the evidence? Just make another headline about how kids do just as well in any household and move on. Well, you can't move on from the truth. The facts will have their say, but of course, by then the political damage will have been done. And then for the remaining time, only because of this audience of Christian pastors, priests, and people, I will deviate onto one element of our concerns that are completely off message, not to be talked about with the general public, but of deep concern to us, and that is the matter of religious freedom. And so that I keep it tight, I'll try and not deviate from the text, which, let's focus ourselves with those words from John Howard, speaking at Campion College. There's some Campion students here. He said in 2011, changing the definition of marriage, which has lasted for time immemorial, is not an exercise in human rights and equality. It is, says John Howard, an exercise in deauthorising the Judeo-Christian influence in our society. And any who pretend otherwise are deluding themselves. Now, they say that it, takes a village to raise a child. So if we are going to raise tomorrow's children according to the values of this LGBT revolution, it will, of course, be necessary to purge the village of reactionary moral leaders. That means faithful pastors, priests, and rabbis. A law for homosexual marriage will strike the shepherds and the sheep will be scattered. It will intimidate religious leaders and their insurers with the relentless threat of anti-discrimination lawsuits. Traditional moral teaching will become something to be whispered in private. There ain't room in this village for both state-enforced homosexual orthodoxy and Christian moral orthodoxy. The serious sexual revolutionaries know that once homosexual marriage is the law of the land, the power of the anti-discrimination law to silence conscientious objectors and indoctrinate children, including those of religious homes, into approved LGBT views will be complete. In this way, the entire moral community surrounding a child will be harassed into ideological correctness. I want to give you an insight that I found very, very, very powerful from a psychiatrist, Jeffrey Satanova. The culture of man-woman faithful marriage that flowed from Genesis and was so forcefully reaffirmed by Jesus was a radical rebuke to the unconstrained sexual practices of the surrounding nations around Israel. And if we are to understand the moral and spiritual consequences of a move to deconstruct man-woman marriage and recreate a culture without sexual boundaries, which is the essence of this proposal, then let's take a brief look back at those societies. In the view of that great secular Jew, Sigmund Freud, civilizational vitality could only be achieved by the discipline of sexual repression, the imposition of boundaries on sexual behaviour. A Jewish author, Dennis Prager, makes the same observation when comparing the progress of Judeo-Christian civilization with pagan society of the ancient world. He says this: man's nature, undisciplined by values, will allow sex to dominate his life and the life of society. It is not overstated to say that the Torah's prohibition of non-marital sex made the creation of Western civilization possible. Societies that did not place boundaries around sexuality were stymied in their development. In Judaism, end quote. This assertion of marital faithfulness was a revolt against the idolatrous sexual polymorphism of the tribes around, including great cities like Babylon. Psychiatrist Dr. Jeffrey Satanova links this cultural phenomenon with the psychological. Quote, the idolatry warned against in both Hebrew and Christian scripture is not some vague intellectual nodding to a wood or stone model, but rather the repeated attraction to an ecstatic, pagan, orgiastic form of nature worship, involving both male and female ritual prostitution in an unlimited variety of sexual forms. The overwhelming power, says Dr. Satanova, of sexual gratification is what makes it so susceptible to becoming a true compulsion. The Bible, therefore, most often condemns ritualized sexual compulsion as a quintessential act of idolatry. Thus, the Apostle Paul cried out to all those in the Roman Empire who would listen, calling them away from the sexual worship of their many gods to the worship of the Holy One of Israel. These gods in Paul's time were but the multicultural variants of the same Baal and Astarte and Molech, against whose worship the earlier Israelite prophets had cried out to the Jewish people, making clear the link between idolatry and unconstrained sexuality. End quote. What's this got to do with the present challenge? Well, the ancient sexual revolution moved away from unconstrained sexuality towards closely constrained monogamy. And as such, it's been the antithesis of our own sexual revolution of the last 50 years. Our own revolt, in Satanova's view, has brought our culture closer to the unconstrained sexuality, which is the essence of idolatry of the pagan world. He says, a biblically informed perspective on our own era would consider it to be similarly idolatrous, dominated by materialistic sexual hedonism, undergirded by a secularized quasi-occult theology, end quote. Now, most of the materialistic sexual hedonism he refers to is heterosexual in our society. But Satanova, through his professional understanding of the homosexual drive, sees that as an often supercharged form of sexual compulsion, an additional powerful influence towards a culture of unconstrained sexuality. And he explains the demoralizing power of any of these forms of compulsion. He says, quote, "They're neither simple choices nor true illnesses. They are a category unto themselves that includes elements of both choice and illness, a process, a path by which a free moral life is progressively, not all at once, undone. It is this erosion of moral capacity that makes these preeminently spiritual conditions. Thus we identify a whole class of non-illnesses that nonetheless make people sick at heart. This, says Satanova, is what the Bible calls idolatry, that central sin that wrought the destruction of ancient Israel as it does of all peoples and all nations." So this depiction of ancient idolatry energised by sex without boundaries has a strange resonance with the slogan for genderless marriage, "Love knows no boundaries." As Satanova notes, the hallmark of a society in which all sexual constraints have been set aside is that it finally sanctions homosexuality as well, end quote. He gives historical context to our present struggle over the normalisation of homosexual behaviour, and beyond that, as we now know, of pansexuality and gender fluidity. Satanova sees it as a recurrence in modern times of that ancient confrontation between a spiritual culture of man-woman faithfulness and a culture of unconstrained sexuality. And his final words are worth noting. Quote, "Because it is not really a battle over mere sexuality, but rather over which spirit shall claim our allegiance, the cultural and political battle over homosexuality has become, in many respects, the defining moment for our society. It has implications that go far beyond the surface matter of gay rights. And so the more important dimension of this battle, he says, is not the political one, it is the one for the individual human soul," end quote. So that's why I thought we could discuss it in this audience. The battle for the individual human soul is core business for pastors and priests. They are the ones who understand the dark things of a culture in archetypal spiritual terms. That is why their potentially powerful voices must be silenced by force of law if the new but ancient creed of unconstrained sexuality is to successfully deauthorise the Judeo-Christian influence in our society. The point is, this is much deeper than we realise. It's much more profound than we can understand. If we lose this, and I hope we won't, but if we do lose this, it will be another exile into Babylon. American friends said they felt like aliens in their own country when marriage changed in America. But there is always hope. And like Nehemiah coming out of Babylon, he came back to Jerusalem and he rebuilt the walls. And for us, I suspect that if we were to lose this, it will be a period of exile, but there is always that hope that we can rebuild the walls around a purified faith, a purified culture. Never, never, never do we lose hope. Thank you.